Today we're going to be sewing with vinyl. This is item number 132855. It is a pink tinted clear vinyl. The weight of this is very, very thin. I would say about 1/16 of an inch. I don't know the millimeter conversion, but you can find that online. When you're sewing this particular fabric, you have to be sure that you're using the right tools. So before we jump into sewing samples of vinyl, you want to be sure that you keep your vinyl on the roll so that it doesn't get creased or wrinkled. And typically when you order this type of fabric or material, whatever you prefer labeling it as, it will come on a roll, and it should come with tissue paper in between each layer. The tissue paper keeps from static affecting the overall flatness and quality of your vinyl. On top of it, you want to be sure that you keep this tissue paper wrapping that is coming with your vinyl, because you can use this to sew, which I'm also going to show you how to do when we get the machine set up. You want to be sure that you're using a size 14 needle or smaller depending on the weight of your vinyl. So you're going to have to do a sample first to be sure that you know exactly what is working and what isn't working for the weight that you've purchased. Be sure that you're using polyester thread, and we're going to get into a new tool that's called a Teflon foot. A Teflon foot has a plastic foot. It is the attachment for the machine. You probably have a walking foot or a basic foot on your machine right now. But if you do not have a Teflon foot, I'll show you a trick on how you can use your regular foot for sewing vinyl. Sewing vinyl is a lot like leather. It is very, very, very slippery. So we want to be sure that our foot is not getting stuck to this, because if you use a metal presser foot, it will get stuck to this, and the feed dogs will not be able to push the fabric as it's going through the machine or attempting to. You want to be sure as well that you do not back tack. When you start sewing on this type of fabric, you're just going to sew right through the seam, and be sure that you use clips, or you can use tiny binder clips. Mood has these awesome wonder clips online that you can find on the website as well. And it's great to use because you can just join two pieces of your vinyl together and it won't leave indentations. Another thing is that you'll never use pins when you're using vinyl, and it's better to use a paper scissor when cutting this as well. Because if you use a fabric scissor that's really expensive or really fancy, and when I say fancy I just mean expensive, but if you use a very high quality fabric scissor on this fabric, it's just going to dull your blade, and it's not worth the risk, because getting your scissors sharpened, especially right now, is very, very difficult. So we're gonna jump over to the machine and I'm gonna show you how to sew some samples of vinyl. So earlier I mentioned a Teflon foot. This foot literally is just a plastic foot, similar to your regular presser foot attachment, but this is for an industrial sewing machine, so I cannot use it with my home machine. Instead, I'm going to make a faux Teflon foot out of my home machine attachment. So what you can do is you can take a piece of Scotch tape and you're going to put it on the bottom of your presser foot, and you're going to trim away all of the excess around there so it doesn't get caught up on your fabric. We will have our faux Teflon foot, and it will make our lives a lot easier because the fabric will actually glide underneath the foot versus having a regular presser foot on the machine and trying to sew vinyl. It'll get stuck together. You also want to be sure that you obviously get the tape out of where your needle is going down into the foot. Now I have my faux Teflon foot that has my Scotch tape on the bottom. And you'll notice even when I take my vinyl and I run my foot along it, it doesn't get stuck, versus it not having that plasticky surface on the bottom. I'm going to reattach this. I have my polyester thread already in my machine. Need a bobbin as well. And I do want to make my stitch length a hair bigger. Also be sure that your machine is set to a straight stitch. You also may have to mess with your width to be sure that your needle is falling dead center in your presser foot. So you're going to take your 2 sheets of vinyl, and what you're going to do is you are going to put cornstarch in between the two so that it is easier for you to lay your seam allowances perfectly on top of one another, because you don't want them to get sticky and then you have to keep peeling and peeling to readjust that. So instead, we're gonna lay these pieces as nicely as we can on top of one another. And then you're gonna take 2 sheets of your tissue paper and you're gonna place them on either side of your vinyl. Everyone's machine is different, and granted, we did make our faux Teflon foot, and you're gonna have to sew a sample before you commit to how you will be sewing this. So never start sewing on the official garment first if you are uncertain of how to sew a particular fabric. So I use my Wonder Clips, and I have my vinyl sandwiched between 2 pieces of tissue paper, and my machine is set on a straight stitch. I have my length at a 4 and my tension at a 5. So those are things that you're gonna need to adjust as well when you're sewing vinyl. So when I sew this, I'm gonna go as slowly as possible, because if I sew too quickly, I may go off of my seam allowance. And once the holes are in your vinyl, you can't take them out. So you'll have to recut the entire piece that you have to sew, because the holes, it's not as forgiving as other fabrics where with like a wool, you barely see the hole from the needle. But because this is plastic, it's going to leave those marks in your fabric. So we're not gonna back tack, I'm just gonna sew. You can, by all means, take a ruler and mark your seam allowance first so everything is super precise. You're gonna wanna give your fabric a little bit of a boost as well, so you're really dictating where that is going in the machine. And I'm not back tacking, so I'm just gonna release this from my machine. So now we have our stitch, and thankfully our tension was great. And what the stitch creates with the tissue paper is like a perforated, like a dotted line. So like when you pull a check off of a pay stub, you have like a perforated dotted line like that. So you're gonna just hold your seam allowance and tear that away. I showed you this trick before with the evening wear fabric video. And you don't want to pull your stitches by accident, so be very gentle. And do the same for the other side. You can always go back and trim up your seam allowance, or if you want to even do like a design with the seam allowance, you could like cut it zigzaggy so that's showing on the inside or the outside. And then you can just brush away the cornstarch so that you have no excess. You don't want to use water on this because it'll leave streaks. But that is your seam. When you press open seams for vinyl, you can either do that by hand, or you can put your vinyl in between a stack of books. Even the heat from your body can make those seams stay flat open. Another way to press is you'll take your iron and you'll iron your ironing board so it gets a little warm. And as long as it's not too warm that you can't touch it with your hand, you can place your vinyl with your seam allowance side down, and then you can just hold that in place and your seams will become nice and flat. So I'll show you how to do that as well. And we also have the embossed croc sample, which is a little bit more forgiving, okay? So this is still gonna shift similarly to leather, and you still wanna have your faux Teflon foot. Again, by all means, if you can get your hands on a Teflon foot or you own one, use the Teflon foot. Otherwise, Scotch tape on the bottom of your regular foot. You can just peel it off later. Use like Goo Gone to get any sticky residue off. So with the embossed vinyl or embossed faux leather, you will put them face to face, and you have a lot more control with cutting this because the backing is kind of like this soft, almost like knit fabric, but there is no stretch, obviously. So I'm gonna use my cornstarch method, but not too much because I don't want it to get stuck in the grooves of this design here. Although I can brush that off later. So I'm gonna lay these face to face. And it is the same approach as sewing just straight up clear vinyl, but I'm not gonna use tissue paper with this only because it's already so soft that the feed dogs are gonna feel like, oh wait, but this is just regular fabric, right? It's just a little thicker. So I'm gonna keep all of my settings on my machine the same, and I'm gonna run this through. I'm not gonna back tack. I think with this type of fabric, you can do samples, and if your machine is forgiving enough to do a back tack at the start and the finish, by all means do that. But I'm not gonna risk it because this is my baby, unless I use my industrial machine, but we just don't wanna risk her life. So be patient, be understanding, do not be forceful with your machine. Oh, there's cornstarch all over my cutting table. All right, so I'm just gonna run her through really softly. And as I get to my wonder clips, I'm gonna take them out. There's another tool that's called Wonder Tape, and that is just like glue. It's just like tape, like you can just glue your seam shut. But I don't believe in using glue for garments. Unless it's like hem tape and something temporary or just like a fix, by all means. But you have so much more stability and strength with using stitches in the machine. So tension's all good on either side. And there she is. And the same with this type of faux leather or vinyl. And I call it vinyl because it does have like a vinyl side, but technically it's a faux leather because it has the impersonation of being a skin. So I'll show you some pressing techniques. So while my iron warms up, just a heads up, I have her on a nylon setting, which is the lowest, but I just want to encourage the iron to get warm, get in the mood for working. And on top of it, it's another technique that I want to show you is you're going to make your ironing board nice and warm because we don't want to melt the vinyl. We just want to be sure that there's a surface that's going to have a chemical response to our vinyl. I don't know if it's a chemical response, but something's happening where our vinyl is not melting, but it is forming due to the temperature that it is adhering to. So that's not warm enough. You want to be sure you can still touch the ironing board, but not burn yourself, but it not be too hot for the vinyl. And again, you'll have to use like a practice sample first. All right, so I'm gonna lay my sample with the vinyl side down. And you can place a book on top of this, but honestly, like once it feels the heat, it's gonna start to conform to that. So mine's not completely flat, but that is a significant amount more than when I did it just by hand, and it feels a little floppy too. But what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna use a presser cloth. I just use a scrap of muslin, and I'm gonna do 2 layers of this muslin scrap just to be safe. And I'm gonna turn my setting 1 setting up because I don't wanna like melt my vinyl. And you don't wanna use steam at all either because it's not gonna make any effect on your vinyl, it's just gonna make it wet. So now that my iron's getting a little warmer, I'm just gonna press. I'm giving a little weight on top of my iron as well, because you don't want to melt your vinyl, then it's going to start curling and you'll never get those curls out. Oh wow, yeah. So I'm going to let her cool off for a sec, and in the meantime we'll talk about our embossed faux leather. So I brushed out as best I could the cornstarch. You can't even see it. And I'm pretty happy with the stitch length. I may, if I was using this like stitch for the final garment, I might possibly make it a little bit smaller depending on what the garment is. But we're gonna use a similar technique for pressing the faux leather because we don't wanna melt the emboss. You don't wanna change the effect that it has on the actual fabric. So let's check on our pink vinyl. And voila. So she's nice and flat, still a little warm, but with that heat makes her a little more pliable. So depending on what you're making with this, heat can be your best friend. And that is pressing vinyl. And then you would just physically knot your ends to create a nice closed edge to your stitches. Now we're gonna press our embossed vinyl. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna leave it face up, and since I'm using my presser cloth, I don't have to worry about affecting my, my embossed pattern, but I'm gonna turn my iron down a setting because it is still pretty warm from using it on that second setting. And we don't want to melt it. We don't want to warp the embossed effect. It's not too hot that I can touch it with my hands and it doesn't hurt. So I'm just giving it a little pressure to be sure it's really absorbing that heat and staying flat. And I don't want to put too much heat because I don't want to melt it. But while it's still warm, I'm going to flip to the wrong side because I can use a little more heat on the back. I'm using steam. Again, it depends on what faux leather you're using or what vinyl you're using. And this is a little less resilient, so I'm going to come in with my Wonder Clips and I'm going to leave this clipped for a little while so it can really absorb that heat. And you can put this in between like a stack of books. That's the beauty of using the true vinyl, is that if you have wrinkles in this, you can just like set it out in the sun and it'll, like, from the heat of the sun, like of the UV, it'll make it nice and flat. So obviously keep an eye on it because you don't want to leave it out for too long, but that is how you sew and press vinyl. Have fun.